Good afternoon, everyone. Isn't it wonderful to be back on campus? Yeah. Those elevators were lonely, being there by myself, and the students were missing, the faculty were missing, everybody was missing. But it is wonderful to be back, and welcome to the opening panel for our annual American Dream Reconsidered Conference. We begin today by acknowledging that the land we gather on is the traditional unceded territory of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. We honor with gratitude this land and the indigenous people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. I wish to thank Roosevelt University alum and board chair, Maurice Smith, for his ongoing service and support. The leadership of Maurice and the financial support from Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Illinois, our title sponsor, makes this conference possible. The American Dream Reconsidered Conference started as a vision, and it is now in its 7th year, thanks to the generous support of Blue Cross Blue Shield. Each year, as part of this sponsorship of the conference, Blue Cross Blue Shield also generously funds several scholarships for our students. We are pleased to announce that this year's 3 recipients are Nazari Michaelenko from the Chicago College of Performing Arts, Sophia Gale, College of Arts and Sciences, and Rochelle Vinson, College of Science, Health, and Pharmacy. These students were nominated by Roosevelt faculty and staff and selected based upon their strong commitment to social justice through service and community engagement. So congratulations to this year's deserving recipients, and thank you again to Blue Cross Blue Shield for their support. Now, this year's conference is organized around the theme of the city and the American dream. And I cannot think of a better panel to open our discussion than race and the city. Cities have served as a key sites of economic innovation and growth, cultural self-expression, and Central American ideas. But they also continue to occupy a complicated place in our national self-conception, as shown by the urban-rural split that cleaves our national political map. All of this makes the city an ideal lens through which to reconsider the American dream, and it is especially appropriate to do so at Roosevelt University in the heart of the beautiful city of Chicago. Race, in particular, has played an outsized role in shaping our urban landscapes. America's racial divisions have seen their starkest expression in cities, whether through segregation laws or practices such as redlining. This panel will explore the roots of our urban racial problems, and I hope offer some thoughts on how we can begin to dismantle the racial divisions that trouble our city landscapes. I want to thank Roosevelt University journalism professor John Fountain for moderating today's panel. Professor Fountain has had a distinguished career as a newspaper reporter and has won multiple awards and has just returned from a Fulbright from Ghana. He has also published several books, including, most recently, Soul Cries, in Black and White and Shades of Gray, which thoughtfully examines many of the same issues we will be discussing today. We're also fortunate to have 2 distinguished panelists to help us gain a deeper understanding of these issues. But I will let Professor Fountain tell you more about them. So thank you all for being here. It gives me hope for the future of our cities when we're having these kind of discussions. Thank you. Professor Fountain?
Thank you, President Ali, and good afternoon and welcome. I am John Fountain. Thank you for joining us for the American Dream Reconsidered Conference and this panel titled Race and the City. In just a few moments, I will introduce our panelists for today's discussion, a discussion that we hope, will be more a conversation as together we explore the history, underpinnings, and ramifications of social divisions in the metropolis, but not without also discussing possible solutions and strategies to building a brighter, perhaps less divided Chicago for future generations and our own posterity. I will mediate the discussion over the next 50 minutes or so with questions posed to our panelists, leaving about 15 minutes for you, the audience, to ask questions or to comment. In tailoring today's discussion, we have aligned the questions under 3 sub-themes: the overarching history and the causes of Chicago's racial divisions, the challenges and current portrait of life in what remains one of America's most segregated cities, and finally, the potential solutions or strategies and the role of policymakers and community and religious leaders as well as citizens, as well as you. Then we'll have audience questions and final thoughts. Let's get started. Joining us are Professor Mary Pattillo and Professor Adam Green. A groundbreaking sociologist, Dr. Mary E. Pattillo is the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and Chair, Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. Her areas of interest include race and ethnicity, urban sociology, inequality, housing, education, criminal legal studies, Black communities, and qualitative methods. Her books include Black on the Block, The Politics of Race and Class in the City, University of Chicago Press, and Imprisoning America, The Social Effects of Mass Incarceration. Dr. Adam Green is Associate Professor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, along with History, at the University of Chicago. He recently completed service on the City of Chicago's Advisory Committee on Monuments and Memorials and is currently co-chairing the 4-year Council on University Community Relations at the University of Chicago. He is author of Selling the Race, Culture and Community in Black Chicago, 1940 to 1955, University of Chicago Press, and co-editor of Time Longer Than Rope, Studies in African American Activism, 1850 to 1950. I will tell you something else about Professor Green. That's for later. It's a bit of a gem and a surprise, so hold on to that, hold me to it. But please join me in giving a hearty welcome for our illustrious panelists. Again, on behalf of Roosevelt University, welcome. The first question I'd like to pose to both of you as we reconsider the American dream is, what exactly is the American dream? And related, what is your assessment of whether that dream has been or is at all attainable for people in Chicago, regardless of race or class, even more specifically for African Americans?
Well, maybe I'll start with that. As it turned out, I was talking about this coming up in the elevator with Professor Trees, who escorted me up. I mean, the American dream means many very tangible and I think recognizable elements, the ability to own a home, the ability either to advance yourself over the course of your life in terms of your work, your occupation, your status, or, and I think this is very important to sort of put out in relation to African Americans, to imagine advancement across generations, where you might be limited, but then the next generation might have greater prospects. And I think we often use those to describe it, and I think there's also, if I can trespass into political science, a way to think about it conceptually and theoretically, which really gets at the heart of some problems that we're facing right now as a civil society. This society is founded on having a government, a constitution, various institutions that can protect people in terms of negative liberties, ways in which they can't be interfered with by different institutions. I think the American dream, in a lot of ways, about progressing from negative liberties to positive freedoms. What does it mean not only to be protected by institutions, but what does it mean to enjoy, to kind of hone your talents, to be able to express and realize particular sorts of geniuses that you're capable of? I'm looking in the front row, actually, at Lisa Yoon Lee, who's the director of the National Public Housing Museum. And I heard this wonderful program that was on WBEZ as I was driving down about what the museum is up to. And particularly the segment about music in terms of Chicago and the ways in which, not only in Chicago, but in New York in relation to hip hop, in Detroit in relation to Motown, so many places that were challenged, materially in terms of public housing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, 80s, 90s, were hotbeds of people coming up with extraordinary contributions in terms of culture. That, to me, is an expression of the American dream. What does it mean to realize that there's a genius inside of you and harness the resources, even when those resources are often held away from you, to be able to make your contribution, make your mark, establish your fame, but also give something to the narrative and the story of what it means to be a creative person, a related person, and a person that belongs within a larger community making contributions. So to my mind, the human dream is about, or the American dream is about people being able to go further in relation to the kinds of contributions they're making in society. And there's much to say about both what Black people, particularly, I think, have done with that, but also the restrictions that have been placed, not only on them doing that, but being able to recognize that they're doing that.
Oh, I want to live in Adam's world, in Dr. Green's world. That was beautiful and beautifully expansive, and I think, very correct. I was thinking much more narrowly. So my first book is entitled Black Picket Fences, and it is a play on white picket fences, which I don't think now there are many picket fences at all around the country, but probably in the 50s there were white picket fences. And this was the kind of material instantiation of the American dream, that you had a single family home with a white picket fence, which symbolized the kind of protection of one's nuclear family on private property that was set off by boundaries and barriers that other people couldn't trespass on. And the title of the book, Black Picket Fences, really asks the question, have middle-class African Americans been able to share in that part of the American dream, in the kind of place-based American dream, and the neighborhood-based in home ownership, and what do places where middle-class Black people live tend to look like? And the cover of the book is a piece of art done by Kerry James Marshall, Chicago's own Kerry James Marshall, where, really serendipitously, his artwork is about a kind of backyard barbecue on the 4th of July, but Black folks in a backyard barbecue on the 4th of July. You see a home in the background. It very much captures what one might think of as the American dream, but if any of you all have seen Kerry James Marshall's artwork, there's always a critique in there. And so the billowing smoke of the barbecue grill creates a kind of ominous look in what otherwise should be a celebratory moment. And it really, I think, illustrates what I was trying to illustrate in the book, which is the American dream for middle-class black folks always has a bit of a smoky veneer. That there is, I mean, just kind of statistically, the black middle class is much more likely to be lower middle class than upper middle class as compared to white people. The black middle class is, has much lower wealth holdings. The black middle class is much more likely, their children are much more likely to be downwardly mobile than are the children of white middle class families. So I could continue on with those kind of statistics. Surely, I mean, the subtitle of the book is Privilege and Peril Among the Black Middle Class. Surely there are privileges. Many of the people in the book, that in the research that I did, sent their kids to private schools. Many of them went on to college. But this fragility of the black middle class is really what I was trying to get at, and that I think very much speaks to the racialized American dream. And then the one other Debbie Downer tilt I'll put on this, since I think this again was a really beautiful, elaborate, right, a beautiful, expansive notion of the American dream, is to ask the question about the kind of the materialist nature of the American dream, the capitalist nature of the American dream, the way that the American dream that white people were able to obtain was predicated on the exploitation, subjugation of African Americans, that accumulation of wealth and of Native Americans. I mean, I don't want to go too historical, but you know, from the Homestead Act to the dispossession of Native American land that enriched white people, and that led to, and then of course all of the policies that allowed for single-family home ownership, from the Federal Housing Administration's mortgage insurance program, that were all deeply racist, and that led to the word that I think is now more on the tip of our tongues, especially post-George Floyd, when I think this kind of public education has been more apparent, redlining, which kind of grew out of these government programs that enabled a white American dream and disabled a black American dream, I think kind of calls into question at least how it's been operationalized, perhaps not what it could be, but what it has been.
Wow, wonderful. I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to throw you a curveball. This isn't on my sheet. Professor Green, you talked about music, and Professor Pattillo, you described a scene that I think all of us who are African American in Chicago and across this nation, in terms of the experience, the lived black experience of celebration and the barbecue and the smoke. I never quite thought of it that way in the way that you couched it. But here's my curveball in terms of music. If you were characterizing the American dream, what song? I've got one in my mind.
That's a curveball, that is. Ooh, I got one.
Okay.
One song. In terms of Chicago, thinking about Chicago, I'd have to choose between, I think, two songs.
Okay.
Either People Get Ready by the Impressions, or We're a Winner, which I learned of for the first time, because I didn't grow up in Chicago. I grew up in New York City. And you know, being a young person, beginning to be a reader, and as a teenager, I began to pick up sports biographies. And one of them was actually a book by Walt Frazier. And he talked about, you know, his sort of early years. He actually went to Southern Illinois, so I guess he's got some Illinois sort of props here. He talked about the 69-70 season when the Knicks won the championship. And he spoke about the ways in which We're a Winner was always on the tape deck when they were in the locker room. And, you know, again, I mean, I think what's beginning to come up around this is peril and pleasure, or peril and hope. Again, I think that part of the reason why I wanted to start with that motif, and I apologize for it being a little bit abstract and conceptual, is that protections are very important in relation to thinking about opportunities. And when you don't feel like you have certain kinds of protections in place, then it becomes difficult to imagine a better future for yourself. And I think that that then means what I assume, later on in the conversation we're going to get into a lot more fully, is how we flip the criticisms of why we find these problems existing in Chicago today from what are the behaviors of people within communities that are adversely affected to what's our capacity as a larger society to recognize the assets that exist within these communities, the value that are in these communities, and the ways in which properly appreciating these communities, whether it's the impressions coming out of Cabrini Green, whether it's the importance of a song like Precious Lord talking about trial, and at the same time imagining a humanity and a spirit and a faith coming through. We could go on and on and on in terms of landmarks about this, in terms of Chicago music. That if we want to prosper, and if I think in some ways, given the challenges we're talking about, if we want to survive as a society going forward in the future, we need to do a better job of appreciating the positive assets that exist in all of our communities, particularly Black communities.
Definitely.
Thank you.
So wasn't thinking specifically about Chicago when I thought of the first song. I thought of Parliament Funkadelic, One Nation Under a Groove. And I love that song. I grew up in Milwaukee, and we used to have to do the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And
You put your free flag up before you would do the pledge?
exactly, yeah, well, hand here. And we would be giggling the whole time because, it goes one nation under God is how that starts. But this was the moment of Parliament Funkadelic. So we would all say, one nation under a groove, and then we'd bust out laughing. And of course, get in trouble. But getting down just for the funk of it. What I love about that is it mixes this kind of, clever pseudo-patriotism with feeling good. And I think, that's what you're getting at, Adam, is peril and pleasure. And Parliament ain't nothing if it's not about pleasure. And so I like that mixing of, kind of patriotism and pleasure in wrapped up in Black funk. And then I started thinking about Chicago, and I thought of the Staples Singers, I'll Take You There, which is another kind of vision. Ain't nobody crying, ain't nobody smiling, ain't nobody lying to the races. I'm not gonna get all the, we have to have the music in order to sing along, and then we have the music, we all know the words, but I'm not gonna be able to call them up right here. But it is about this vision of a kind of non-racial place of pleasure, joy, achievement, family, community. And so, those two came to mind.
Wow. Ain't no smiling faces,
lying to the races. There you go.
I'll take you there.
Yep.
That's all I'm going to sing.
With a bass line.
Which is
bass
affirming a
line.
goal.
With a
and
mean
also
bass line.
Yeah.
It's affirming a goal and it's mapping a distance.
Yes.
This is where we got to get to
Yep.
in order to be able to move past those problems.
I will tell you, my two are Makes Me Want to Holler, Throw Up Both My Hands, Marvin Gaye, and the other is a gospel song, almost. It is Sam Cooke. Change is going to come.
Change is gonna come.
Because it is a song of hope. I want to ask, does the concept of the American dream look different today than it looked yesterday? Is it different? The picket fence and the house and the job and the...
Yep. So your question makes me think generationally. And you have two people of the same generation, so that means we have to be a mouthpiece for what we imagine the next generation to be like. And that mouthpiece comes from the fact that we are teachers, and so we do, interact with young people a lot. And I think it is very different, very, very different, actually. I think at least among, well, I don't know if the word is progressive or quite what the word is, but I think there is more attention, there's less of a materialism and more of attention to a development of a whole self. You know, and I see this in from quiet quitting to a real recognition that talking about mental health is appropriate and important. And those are the things that make me think about that an American dream is kind of like the expansive version that I think Dr. Green was talking about, which is about a whole self, which is about one's creativity and one's productivity, not being the same thing, but being part of you know, one's full self. And I think, and it could just be the kind of optimism of young people, and the young people I see today will grow up to be just like us, perhaps more materialistic, perhaps more compartmentalized, perhaps overworking, perhaps doing never quiet quitting. Perhaps that will happen, but for now, I see definitely, and I see how they are pushing in the workplace, pushing these things in the workplace. So that's one thing I'd say.
Yeah, I agree, I think, very much with the idea that this is being filled out. It's one of the things that I'm taking inspiration from in terms of thinking about, you know, this line of inquiry and research myself. Possessive individualism is often the kind of, again, conceptual marker that's assigned to the ways in which Americans particularly think about those opportunities. And I think personal self-care and wellness in terms of thinking about the need to put oneself in a kind of positive relationship with community, I think is the kind of evolution, really, that people have realized. But now I'm gonna play Debbie Downer. Because I think when Mary, myself, people older than us came of age, this was a society and a country in which substantial inequality existed, but was much less tolerated, to say nothing of celebrated, than has been the case over the last 20 or 30 years. And again, this is where I think both protections and structural conditions begin to impede on people's capacity to take care of themselves, to realize kind of whole senses of personality, whole senses of identity. Because when you have the concentration of resources and the hoarding of opportunities, not just among, you know, the most wealthy, which I think generally comes up, but there's obviously, I think, a very important literature about talking about people in our class strata who tend to also hoard opportunity in relation to what school districts can actually command in relation to resources, depending on the kinds of tax policies that are voted in. Or what are the ways in which people think about markets as creating conditions in which home ownership is next to impossible for somebody with, you know, what effectively now is an upper working class job or lower middle class job. That condition, and I think about this a lot in terms of the age that I think you and I are at, Mary, the ages probably that we're all at. I feel like I've seen that unravel in my lifetime. And it's not that it can't be repaired, but that's a huge loss in terms of thinking about growing up in housing, in my case in New York City, that was not public housing, but was actually funded by unions. ILGW union buildings, International Ladies Garment Worker Union buildings that were based on the west side of Manhattan. And, you know, those buildings are in the process of being privatized now, as are many of the kind of old Commonwealth commitments of the 1930s and 1940s in terms of making it possible for people to start, you know, to some degree from an equal kind of plane. So I kind of feel like that has to be spoken about in terms of thinking about what's happened to the American dream. Part of the problem is that the American dream is understood in very individuated, very limited, and I would say extremely selfish ways on the part of too many sectors of society. And too many institutions find ways to align themselves with that shift rather than pushing against it for the sake of having people buy in. You know, and the despair the problems in relation to thinking about frustration and movement away, maybe not the Great Resignation, but really I think the sense of people moving over to workers' compensation or disability in terms of thinking about, how to imagine a kind of survival into middle and old age. And then the despair that's been documented by economists like Angus Deaton and Mary Case that's leading to these, die-offs, literally. And now not in the black community, but in the white community.
Right.
That's telling us that something is really off right now, I think, in terms of, what that dream, which is beautiful and grounded in who we want to be as people, what's happening to that, though, in terms of the pressures that are adverse and negative.
Excellent. As both of you were speaking, and we'll come to this at some point in our conversation, but I grew up in a place not far from here in North Lawndale, and I can tell you that for so many people, the American dream for them is a nightmare. And I want us to talk about that, because it is something that I think as a journalist I well know is hidden from so much public light, and that needs to be, I think, discussed in terms of bringing everyone forward, finding a way to be inclusive regardless of socioeconomics, regardless of race. And it's, as you pointed out, it's so not just about African Americans, but there are people across the spectrum who are in need of finding a way to this so-called American dream. There's a photo here that is classic. And every time I see this photo, I don't know if I was alive then, but
This is 1941.
yes.
This is Russell Lee, 47th and South Parkway.
Yes.
Easter Sunday.
And so what does this photo say to each of you? I look at this photo and I immediately think about the Great Migration. And I think about Chicago, but not only Chicago, just this idea of the northern city of promise, the promised land. And what did Chicago and other northern cities look like during this time? What did they feel like? What was the hope? What was the despair?
All right, so I'll go with a few words. I mean, one, populated. There are people out on this 1941 Easter Sunday, and Russell Lee, the photographer from the Federal Farm Security Administration that did documentary photography all across the country, he shot, I think, maybe 15 or 20 photographs, and this is the most iconic. And you just have a sense of density. Yes. That this is populated, filled out urban space. Very important to think about in terms of the degree of vacancy. Mary, you've written about this, I think, very, very effectively, and others have pointed out like how different these inner city communities look like just in terms of density and population. Aspiration, I mean, it's Easter Sunday. I'm sure they did not have an option to put on their suits and their ties and their hats. I always loved that photos in the 30s and the 40s always show young African-American men with hats. There's a great one that Wayne Miller took of kids playing stickball, and they're all in fedoras. And it's like, well, that's a different code in terms of how you're supposed to look. But they're holding the gaze of the photographer, a white photographer, Russell Lee, and they're holding the gaze largely without smiles at all. And I think that, I remember this photo first encountering it on the cover of Nicholas Lehman's The Promised Land, the book from the late 1980s, which really sort of grounded a lot of conversations about how to think about Chicago and the Great Migration basically not fulfilling its promises. This photo certainly can be read in a range of different ways, I find. And it's reminding us, I think, something probably that we're able now to take up seriously in terms of thinking about the migration arc in terms of African American history, that people came with hope. People came expecting promises to be fulfilled, and it's important to analyze the degree to which those promises were unmet. Again, not because of what people were not capable of doing, but what they were prevented or sort of denied protection in terms of being able to try to do. And especially because it's young men who are so central to the narrative of the dysfunction and the kind of poor life choices that many people attribute to life of African Americans, neighborhoods like Lawndale or Oakland or down in Roseland or the like. I think it's reminding us that we have to take care to read these photographs fully in order to be able to understand, the elements and the context that's creating the futures that will present themselves to these young black men, but the futures in some ways that will be assigned to these young men.
Wow.
So if this is 1941 and it does represent, density, a really jumping black belt, as we would call it, or Bronzeville, or black metropolis, or whatever is the word you want to use. But if it was dense in 1941, it was about to get just super tight.
Right,
so
right.
the second
That's
Great
important.
Migration, 1.5 million black folks moved from the South to the North in each of the decades, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Not all to Chicago, that'd be a lot of black folks, but to the North, from the South to the North. And so what already had been, some of the observers, social scientists of the day talked about the black belt as being hemmed in. So what had been a very restricted area that black folks could move into from, 18th Street on the north to somewhat more porous boundary on the south, 51st Street, moving into 63rd Street on the south, but pretty tight on the edges, Cottage Grove on the east, State Street on the west. Black folks just poured into that little bitty belt. I love the black belt imagery because you think of long and skinny as a belt, and that's just what this was, long and skinny. And so, you just had overcrowding, you had buildings just being worn out, basically. Buildings that were well built, but, when you had kitchenettes and 7 families to a gray stone, to put a lot of wear and tear on the building. So that's what had been happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but also with all that density, that's what got you a bustling, amazing churches that were producing the kind of gospel music and blues and jazz and black businesses and sports leagues and, all of the things, nightclubs, obviously. So it was bustling, it was suffering, it was producing, it was hurting, it was doing all of those things at once. The book Black Metropolis by St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton, which was first published in 1945, and then there were subsequent editions that kind of updated the Great Migration post-1945, has this metaphor of the black ghetto on one hand and black metropolis on the other. And in that they are capturing exactly, I think, the good cop, bad cop that Dr. Green and I have been playing today. There's the peril and the promise, the hurt and the joy, the creativity and the constraints. In that the black ghetto is the word they use to talk about those constraints, to talk about racial discrimination, anti-black violence, and there was a lot of it, Molotov cocktails to keep black folks from moving on the other side of Cottage Grove or moving south of 63rd Street. So those were the, high rates of tuberculosis, all of the things, high rates of poverty, unemployment, and so underemployment, low wages, the job ceiling. All of these things are things that St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton discuss. And then Black Metropolis are the churches, are the numbers runners, are the families, and all of the things, are the politicians, black folks coming into their political own, especially as we have come, given that my family's from Louisiana and participated in that great migration, as we have come from the South without the vote, now to come to the North to be able to elect black politicians. So that's also part of Black Metropolis. So that's what I see when I look at this all at once, kind of all wrapped up in one.
Can I throw one more point in relation to this? Because I think Mary pointing out that the migration after, which is larger than the migration that preceded it, and it's the classic migration, how important that is in terms of thinking about the shaping of Chicago. Here's another thing, and this is actually something that Nicholas Lehman brought in his reading, and he meant it to say, look how far, this has fallen, look how, how much the dream of what people coming up from the South were seeking has been betrayed in a certain sense by people's bad actions as well as kind of malintention from government and institutions and the like. So whenever I teach a class on the 1950s and 1960s, one of the things that I do, I'm sure you do the same thing, is ask the students to look at the population figures by age group that are available in the census. And one of the things that you notice when people are migrating up in the 1940s and 1950s, there's a large number of children from the age of, I think, 5 to 12, and then another group that's from 12 to 17 or 12. I forget how it's cataloged in census records. Anyway, teenagers and young children, huge numbers are coming up as part of the families, and they're whole families now that are migrating in the 1950s and 1960s. One of the great insights that comes out of Black Metropolis, also something I teach in the chapter on the Black middle class experience, is the importance of associations. People want to belong to clubs. People want to have balls on a semi-annual basis. They want to have costume shows. They want to do raffles, so on and so forth. And when you put those two things together, Drake and Caton's insight about African Americans' instinct, passion for a civic life, a way in which they could be together and do things. And then this large number of young people. Well, that's leading you to thinking about, well, how do young people realize that sense of association? And one of the outcomes of it, which I felt like Nicholas Lehman pathologized in his book, was the rise of street gangs. Street gangs, which are coming up very, very prominently in Chicago during the 1950s and 1960s. You can talk about them in a range of different ways. They obviously are great currency in terms of politicians and people who critique cities. At root, they are young people seeking ways to associate with each other, in part because of the difficulty of absorbing them into other kinds of associations, like churches, like social clubs, like a range of other things. And I think that also is just telling us that we have to do a better job of reading the conditions that we see around them. I mean, I think that your work, Mary, in terms of thinking about how to look at this, is an exemplar of how to do careful readings, grounded readings, contextualized readings in terms of a range of different disciplines. But something like the gang problem in Chicago, it goes back in a certain sense to young people's needs to belong to something. And if we started with that, then we could probably have, and I'm sure that would be one of the things that might be talked about in a discussion like this, or by people carrying this out and then speaking to policymakers. You can do this in a way that actually recognizes that people have very ordinary, recognizable, legitimate reasons to go and make the kinds of things that they do in the communities when they feel like they don't have other options. And so that's also an element, I think, that's coming up in this picture. But to read that in a very different way than most people tend to.
This is incredibly rich history and analysis, and I think a peek into what we're going to be doing in just a few moments, talking about possible strategies and approaches. But before we go forward, I want to ask this question, and that is, when I was growing up, people talked about segregation largely as if it were a bad thing. Segregation was bad, integration was good. And if you ask my grandfather, he would say segregation is good. And in the sense of, at one point, in some communities in Chicago, people knew who the doctors were. They lived on their block and so on, and lawyers and Black folks owned businesses, and they had sustainability. So is segregation good and integration bad? Is integration the antidote to healing the racial divide?
Yeah. I will just say this quickly, and then I want to see what Mary says when we get into the conversation. I think speaking only about integration to start, rather than segregation, which would probably be where most people would start. The question that has to be also asked after that is good for whom? Who is served, actually, by creating a form of integration that brings a few people into, for instance, political office, or a few people into the boardroom, or, as I think we've all lived, a few people into knowledge-producing institutions like newspapers or universities. Who's served by letting a few people in, but not necessarily really opening the doors in a city like Chicago? And I think the answer becomes probably not the people where that small number of people, which could be called tokens, are coming from. I feel like we often analyze passing as a way of understanding a form of racial contact where a small number of people have to surreptitiously play their identity. Token is a pejorative phrase, but token structurally, still today, represents largely the ways in which African Americans access high prestige, high functioning, high responsibility jobs. You don't have many places in which 15% of the workforce, which I think is the tipping line that I forget the professors who had done this, the researchers who had done this study, that once you get past 15%, you begin to really see shifts in the culture because people have to actually address that cohort as if they have some power. But the numbers are really more like 5 or 10%, sometimes 2, 3, 4%. In terms of, for instance, most of the places that I've worked at as a faculty member. So integration is not just a good or bad thing on its own. Integration is a good thing for some people because it offers an alibi about the existence of racism. If we have a few people here, then how can you call us racist? But it's also a control on redistributing power. A few people means that there's not really a threat. So I kind of feel like in some ways, segregation is the first thing that we try to analyze, but maybe in order to really address that question seriously, we should think about integration critically and the fact that it means different things and it offers different outcomes for different people. I said it was going to be short and it was long. I apologize.
Thank you, Professor Pattillo.
First of all, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Michelle Boyd, who has a book called Jim Crow Nostalgia, which is about the Bronzeville neighborhood and its transformation in the 1990s. Black folks who, like my book, Black on the Block, who want to create thriving black community in neighborhoods that had been disinvested from. Because I think that's very much on point. And then also Charles Payne has a book, So Much Reform, So Little Change, about school reform for black kids that has a whole chapter about what segregated black schools did for black kids, how black teachers loved black kids, how black teachers with very few resources, poured into black children, had high expectations for black children. All of the things that we know are important for educational success are things that black teachers were doing for black children. And today, there is very clear data that race matching, teacher-student race matching, is important for educational success for black kids, meaning black kids experience less exclusionary discipline when they have black teachers, and they're more likely to go on to graduate from high school and attend college. These are really rigorous studies that show that, and it's very clear that expectations are different as well. That I do have a little factoid in here, if I can. When evaluating the same black student, white teachers were 9 percentage points less likely than their black colleagues to expect that student to earn a college degree. And the bias was slightly more for black male students than for black female students. Wow. So these different expectations, these the different ways of interacting, the interpretation of behavior as things that need to be punished as opposed to things that need to be cultivated, perhaps, I think are things that happened in black schools and that happen when black teachers work with black kids. And I've written about the problem of integration. And I kind of begin with W.E.B. Du Bois's statement, how does it feel to be a problem? Because I think that encapsulates the ideology behind integration is that black spaces are bad. And because being black is a problem. That's what Du Bois asked. How does it feel to be a problem, black people, a problem of the Negro? And so if we think of black spaces as bad, then we want to desegregate them. And we're always desegregating black spaces. We're always moving black kids. I was bused. I was a part of a busing program in Milwaukee. I was bused from my black neighborhood to a place called Whitefish Bay, which we called White Folks Bay. And all the black kids at the school were bused in. There were no black kids who lived in Whitefish Bay. So it's always black kids doing the integrating. And this idea that black spaces are a problem, Du Bois also tells us that what segregation does is allows white people to target bad things at black neighborhoods and to withhold good things from black neighborhoods. And so, yes, that is true. Here's the question. We don't know how to interrupt that. So is that going to always be the case, and thus we cannot have black spaces because they will always be targeted for bad things or withheld, or resources will be withheld from them? Or can we instead celebrate black spaces and change the mindset such that they are places that we do invest in? Because I do think with those, because Du Bois goes on to say, you know, we know that that's what segregation does, but never should you be ashamed of associating with yourselves. Never should black folks say, we shouldn't be living next to each other because something's wrong with us. That's not what Du Bois was thinking, and you know, I very much think of myself as kind of following in that tradition. So the question is, can we interrupt the practices that systematically concentrate bad uses in black spaces and withhold resources? Can we interrupt that through education, through showing that we're doing it now and wanting a different way, through changing people's mindsets? Or is that impossible? Because if it is impossible, then we do have to think about possible integration. So that's the dilemma I don't know the answer to.
Well, I know that time is getting away, and it's okay. This is wonderful. But I want to get to just a little bit of time on current challenges in a portrait of life and what remains what remains one of America's most segregated cities. You know, it was 56 years ago that Dr. King moved to Chicago, specifically to North Lawndale, not far from where I was living at the time as a little boy. And later, William Julius Wilson would characterize the folks of North Lawndale and places like that as the permanent underclass in part and the truly disadvantaged. Some would argue that Chicago was still largely segregated and its impact quantifiable. A 2019 report by New York University School of Medicine found that Chicago has the largest life expectancy gap in the country, with residents of Streeterville living to be 90 years old, but those living just 9 miles away in Inglewood only living to be 60. And another local study found a 16-year life expectancy gap between West Side and downtown Chicago residents. Question, how much, if anything, for Chicago's black poor has changed since Dr. King advocated for the poor nearly 60 years ago? Why or why not? Dr. Pattillo?
Yes, so that is, you know, it's so funny. That is a common question about kind of progress or the lack thereof, and one would think I should have my answer ready, but it always makes me pause every time I hear the question. Because the question is always a little bit of both. The question is, it is true that the poverty rate is much lower now than it was in the 1960s, but much of that progress kind of happened in the early 50s, kind of stalled in the 70s, and we've seen a little bit more progress post about 1996. The child poverty rate is down. Much of this is about social safety net programs, the earned income tax credit. These are kind of wonky ideas that maybe aren't as relevant here. But you know, we've seen definitely a growth in the percentage of black people who have a college degree, a growth in the percentage of black folks who have incomes over, let's say, a high mark of $100,000. But that's not your question about what the experience is like for poor black folks in Chicago. And there, I think, especially an institution that Drake and Caton, for example, did not pay that much attention to, despite the fact that it was still very much an institution that interceded in the lives of black folks at that time, is the criminal legal system. And the the mass incarceration of low skilled and high school level or below educated Black folks has been the kind of systematic extraction of Black folks from Black communities, and then reintroduction into Black communities now labeled without ability to get a job, without ability to qualify for the safety net, introduced to more hardened networks, traumatized by the incarceration experience, disconnected from family networks. I mean, that particular part of the story, yes, Black folks have always experienced disproportionate incarceration when compared to white folks, but we were not imprisoning, 7 million people at one time, and that's just prison. That's not the jails, that's not the parole, that's not the probation, this eternal surveillance state that we currently live in. So I'll just highlight mass incarceration as one way in which I would say that the lives of poor Black folks are worse than they were when King was here because of that real explosion of a system that is not just extracting people, but putting people back in communities now completely kind of disenfranchised, literally, politically, but also disconnected and unable to connect in many ways.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
No, very, very important. My reading as a historian rather than as a sociologist of William Julius Wilson was always hinged, and I think in terms of, a tremendous achievement, to differentiate between the poor that had worked historically and the poor who did not have access to work. And so I think this brings up a second, somewhat earlier paradigm shift, which was not to see African Americans so much as people available to work to the point of utter exploitation, in terms of thinking about how domestic service sort of operated in the minds of employers in the South and in the North, in Chicago. How people thought about entry-level positions without necessarily a ladder of promotion in many of the industries for African Americans working in steel or meat packing or such. But people worked. And industry, of course, began to reorganize itself and shift and change in the 60s and 70s. Some of this was structural. It had to do with the fact that automation more and more was important in terms of the production of the commodities that came out of industry. So when you have automation, whether it's in agriculture or whether it's in the disassembly line of meat packing, you no longer need human hands to do a great deal of the work. And Chicago experienced only maybe 5-10 years before mass incarceration began to really kind of take hold. And it's sort of differentiated depending on which part of the country you're looking at. Toussaint Louzier, who is working on this transition now, and I think his book is coming out in the next year or two, really makes this case that Illinois state government, like, say, the Rockefeller drug laws, was one of the early adapters of prosecutorial, sentencing, and incarceration regimes that could accommodate larger numbers of people coming through the prison system, and that was reflected by what happened. But maybe 10, 15 years before that, and then at the same time, this is happening within the steel industry as opposed to meatpacking. Industrial jobs are disappearing in Chicago. And so just that fact that poor Black people used to be overworked and underpaid, and now poor Black people are essentially alienated from employment opportunities because of spatial mismatch in relation to where the jobs are, because of the ways in which there are filters around allowing people to come in, because of the ways in which qualifications for jobs now that are not industrial jobs, but jobs that require to some degree BAs or education, and people's difficulty in terms of accessing those credentials, means that, Mary, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that what were called ghetto concentrated poverty neighborhoods, where 50 to 70% of people living in those neighborhoods did not have access to regular work. That you had, I think, 9, 10, 11 such communities spread around the city of Chicago during the 1970s and 1980s. And so, I mean, that's a shock. You know, I think it's a shock in the same sort of way that the emergence of mass incarceration was a shock. One thing, though, I think also, we could think about this then within kind of the global economy, that these industries did not disappear. They relocated to places in which there were other sources of labor, where there were other opportunities of scale in terms of production and generating value. People profited from the fact that industry located away from Chicago to someplace else, often offshore. And I think that that's reminding us of something about addressing the problem of segregation from, you know, not the standpoint of people finding ways to be together within that community, but how that community is being engineered to contain people and keep them away from other opportunities. I think blacks in the 20th century did not so much suffer from neglect as they suffered from people being predatory towards them. So overcharging on rent is a way to get an additional profit in relation to people who have no other options. Contract lending is a way to be able to take away from aspiring black homeowners and move that money, you know, not only to white, you know, unscrupulous white real estate agents, but silent partner investors who were doctors, lawyers, probably university professors in the 60s and 70s. And needing to understand that the problem of these communities, in some cases, is neglect and lack of resources, but is also sometimes the ways in which resources have been extracted. And I think mass incarceration and the way that criminal justice operates is a great way of thinking about that because of the impact of fines, fees, probation costs, legal costs, court costs. I mean, just, you know, itemize all of that in relation to what an average black family, I think Lawndale and Austin are some of the communities in which the most people are being sent through the justice system.
Yes.
And, you know, that you got to budget that in terms of how you go year to year, in terms of being a parent. It's something that I think needs to be factored in order to understand. There are a lot of things that need to be brought into these communities, but these communities also need relief from being preyed upon.
Yes.
Can I just add one little thing
Yes.
on that? On this relationship between work and predatory exploitation. You know, black folks are working in prisons. And it's their labor that is generating, first of all, that is totally kind of changing our calculus for how much the criminal legal system costs, how much the prison system costs, because they're working at wages from about 50 cents to about $1.15. The University of Chicago Law School just put out a report about prison labor, and I would really encourage anybody who's interested in this to take a look at it. Some southern states don't pay anything, and then much of the wages in most prisons don't go above about $1.50. And they're doing all the labor in the prison, saving the public billions of dollars in labor costs because of unpaid labor. And of course, then not generating any income for the families that these men and women are parts of back home because their labor is just unpaid.
Wow. Well, this I wish we had another hour. Well, we've gone through this so quickly, it seems. And I'd like to, at this time, have open the floor for any questions or any comments from our audience. Does anyone have any questions? Any comments? There's a hand up.
Regarding the Safety Act that's going into effect January 1st, 2023, what is your opinion on it, and what do you think this will do to affect the black and brown communities regarding like the drug offenses, since they're the ones are usually incarcerated for those offenses?
I didn't quite hear the last part. I know what the general question is. Do you want to say the last part again, please?
Since, like I just said, in regards to black and brown communities, especially regarding the drug offenses, considering they are the ones that are usually targeted.
Yeah, so the Pretrial Safety Act, the biggest part that I'm most familiar with is the elimination of money bond. So this is you're innocent until proven guilty, except you're not, which means when you go through the criminal courts in Cook County in the state of Illinois, you can be held just because you can't pay the $5,000 bond. And if you can pay the $5,000 bond, you get to go home. If you can't pay it, then you have to sit in jail. And the research is very clear that people who are in jail at the time of their either when their case gets called again or when they're at the time of sentencing have a much higher likelihood of being sentenced to prison than people who are out on bail when their case comes up. So there are many downstream negative effects of being in jail just because you couldn't pay the money bond. And what the Pretrial Safety Act will do is eliminate money bond and have a different kind of system to evaluate risk that would not, so either you just cannot get out because you're too risky and we're worried about another crime being committed, or you're let out, sometimes with some conditions, and that's a whole nother question about the expansion of electronic monitoring, but it's not about if you can pay or not, because that's just classism, because if you can pay, you can get out. Okay, so that's the biggest part I'm aware of, and I'm completely supportive. That's also the biggest part that is right now the part that people who are against it are capitalizing on, because of course, when we are in this moment of increased crime in the city of Chicago, people are saying, they're grasping onto this one person who was out on bail who committed another crime. Any of us can find one case to amplify our position, to argue our position, but the research has definitely shown that, in fact, being jailed increases your likelihood of later committing a crime than not being jailed. That is really, really what the research shows. So I think we need to not look at the kind of inflammatory language and instead look at what the research shows, and I am in support of the Pretrial Safety Act.
Thank you for your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is such a good conversation. I want it to go on forever also. So we're living in a time with so many forms of dangerous nationalism that are sort of uprising here in America and elsewhere around the globe also. And I keep thinking about the great Grace Lee Boggs' quote, which is, I love the United States and I love America so much that I want to change it, right? And I'm wondering, I want to focus on the word American, part of the American dream. Do you think it's possible for us to salvage any kind of nationalism that would be worthy of its name for a dream that would be for all people? Or is part of the problem the focus or any kind of, emphasis on the America part?
Wow. Mm-hmm. So there was actually part of our preparation for the conversation. I think there was a prompt about thinking about the relationship of addressing these questions in Chicago in relation to national conversations, national controversies. And I don't want to replicate a tendency on the part of sort of more devolutionist policymakers, people who want to shrink the state and kind of leave people to fend for themselves. Root hog or die was the motto from the late 19th century, and it feels like it's coming back. I don't mean to kind of follow in that vein of disposability. I actually think talking about these problems in Chicago would be well served, at least for the moment, with uncoupling what works for Chicago from the national conversation. Not because there aren't obviously very important issues in terms of thinking about Chicago's relationship to its region, Chicago's relationship within the state, around the ways in which policy crafted in the legislature has impact. I mean, we see this obviously in terms of the way in which school administration is accorded now to actual population rather than, say, need, along the lines of some of the discussions that are beginning to emerge in terms of the mayoral campaign. But I just feel like what's beginning to happen, and I think you touched on it in the introduction, John, There is such a currency to demonizing Chicago and demonizing cities generally right now. And it feels familiar in terms of earlier points, but I actually feel like it may have even intensified to what I recall from the 1980s, as somebody who was going to school at that point and hearing the debates about running against cities, that I'm not sure that there's a lot that can be done by trying to seek common cause, say with national legislatures. Certainly if we have, another Republican administration, even if it's not a Trump administration in 24, it's probably going to be an administration that's going to run against a city like Chicago, particularly Chicago. So why not try to find ways to think back, you're familiar with this, Lisa, to much earlier times in human history and social history where cities actually could operate to some degree as quasi-autonomous polities. I mean, functionally, that's very, very hard to do. Strategically, though, it may not be so much. And so you can think about, how do you craft policy as a city? How do you think about key institutions like Roosevelt University and other higher education institutions in terms of trying to set direction? What kind of program of education emerges? And each time you're doing this, you're thinking a little bit about what is your capacity to operate autonomously. And I know Mary is going to check me in terms of all of the limits around being able to actually do this in a city, and those exist. But I think eventually down the road, there are things and problems, climate crisis, I think in some ways foremost among all, but I also want to say inequality is something that we have to treat as a policy problem. The more that we have that in place, the less it's going to be possible to realize the sort of social cohesion. And I think fight against misinformation, given how susceptible people are to negative narratives when they feel an actual condition of despair. I think trying to operate this at scale within our community here might be one of the best ways to be able to realize progress. And then once we've been able to innovate some ways of operating as a community that's thinking about its well-being in the scale of its community, then we can start to think about how we actually converse more with the national narrative. But the national narrative right now, not everywhere. I mean, I think that some of the policy achievements of the last 2 or 3 years, they're huge, they're significant. But the larger narrative is quite toxic right now. And Chicago is a big part of what gives that, that dynamic, that process fuel. So I think sometimes you have to extract yourself from a dysfunctional relationship in order to find a way to make that relationship functional. And that may be the way that Chicago needs to think about its relationship to the larger country at this point.
Professor Pattillo?
I don't know that I can say anything super coherent in a brief amount of time. I was thinking much more about the kind of boundaries of the nation state, and if you think it's kind of aspirational to think of Chicago operating autonomously, I'm thinking, in line with critical political theorists who might think that the nation-state boundaries are part of the problem, that anything that cuts us off from others leads to the kind of selfishness that, and nationalisms that says all for us, none for you. And I think those nationalisms get then devolved down to groups. So whether it's by race or by class or by gender or by sexuality, all for us and none for you. And it is manifest at various scales of geography or population groups. Religions, of course, all for us, none for you. So I'm thinking much more in a kind of abstract way that all of these things that promote all for us, none for you, decrease our ability to practice any kind of concern for others, and thus will lead to groups that have none because we have crafted, that have nothing, because we have crafted it that way, whether it is other countries that we have systematically impoverished by either stealing or misappropriating natural resources, or whether it's groups within our own society that we have impoverished or excluded or enacted violence against in order to either take what they have or make sure that they don't come for what we have. All of these things, to me, operate on these levels of boundary making and exclusion.
But I think that actually there's a way, again, within Chicago to get to that place. I mean, Chicago, for instance, is among the 2 or 3 most prominent receiver communities in relation to undocumented migrants that have been sent up forcibly against their will by other governments in other localities, Texas and Florida primarily. And you know, the navigation of how to do that in relation to both the response of city government, which I think on the whole has been quite admirable, associations and groups that have received people coming in, and the conversation that's taken place within the city more generally, that we don't have to approach this as a zero-sum situation. We should be a welcoming city. This is something that's actually in the heritage of how the city is operated in terms of refugees from World War I and World War II, refugees in relation to global conflicts at other points. And it feels like, I guess what I'm imagining, and I don't know if this is feasible, is bypassing the toxicity of the national politics in order to think about the consonance of Chicago in relation to global need. I mean, I think in a way that's getting to what you're talking about. And I think that that can happen, but it involves some discipline in terms of thinking about what we're taking in around elsewhere. I'd like Chicago to be known as the place that practices intersectionality rather than the place that is judged according to personal responsibility.
And that is a great place to end. So I want to thank Professor Adam Green, Professor Mary Pattillo for their insight, their expertise, simply profound. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.